Welcome, and what I'm going to do today is share just a few glimpses of video from the battlefield at Vicksburg that involved our ancestors with the 20th Alabama Infantry. It's interesting to walk on battlefields where your ancestors fought, maybe regardless of which side of the conflict that you were on. It's hallowed ground. What the Park Service has done amazingly well is kept it clear enough that you can actually see the topography and how close the fighting was. So the line that you see there off in the distance includes positions held by the 20th Alabama Infantry Regiment. And you can see how close by the blue markers that Union forces even got at this point up to the railroad redoubt. And on down the way we'll see how close they got to our ancestors in the 20th Alabama. Just kind of a random note about my visit. I'm here on a Tuesday. It's the 10th of December and the park is incredibly quiet. I've seen 3 or 4 walkers, a car, and a Class A rental. Maybe it's a Class B, I don't know the difference. But I've basically got the place to myself. It's overcast today. It's in the maybe upper 50s, low 60s. The visitor center, here's the key to the visitor center, is not open on Mondays and Tuesdays. So if you're planning your visit to the park, particularly if it's your first visit where you're more likely to spend time in a visitor center rather than walking on the battlefield, or maybe you do both, but just remember that your visitor center is not open on Mondays and Tuesdays. So parked at the area set aside for parking that's near Fort Garrett, which is where you'll see that the vast majority of the 20th Alabama spent time in defense. Also, you'll see elements of the 30th and the 31st regiments that were in this same vicinity. The fort was named after our commander that was helping establish and hold this area right here on toward the southern end of the lines. And you walk up onto Fort Garrett. As you go into what I think would have been classified as a redoubt, because it was enclosed on all sides. You walk onto the hallowed ground that was occupied by the 20th Alabama. Historically, it's called Hovey's Approach. You can see how close the Union got to the fort. So literally they were this close. They got this far on July the 3rd, which, as you know, that was the beginning of the end, as the surrender actually took place on July 4th. So Hovey's approach to the fort is happening here. You'll see they've come across this low ground from their line and they begin their trenching operations. So your frontal assaults that Grant attempted in other locations obviously did not work. Massive amounts of casualties on both sides, but they could not successfully go up these very steep slopes, just coming straight up. You see, straight up into that fort. Of course, it's just going to be from defilade positions back there 20th Alabama is just going to eat them up. So they began trenching operations, and as they're coming up to this right here, and this approach, remnants of the trenches are still here on Vicksburg. One of the most interesting things about this battlefield, and the Park Service has wonderfully kept a lot of this in place so we can see what's going on. This trench would have been deep enough, of course, that they would have had cover. They get to a point, rather than being exposed out to the ravine, they make a turn, and again they're trenching but maintaining cover from the fort. And continued to dig. They ultimately get within very close proximity of the fort, where then the surrender takes place. And you can see then they made a turn. This is the only way, that the only avenue that they have is straight ahead. There were, and you'll see in videos made by actual historians, where they would create these rolling barricades of items that they would stuff that would be able to stop rifle fire. You still had sharpshooters up there that would pick people off that made the mistake of sticking their head up, but ultimately they would continue to trench undercover, digging their way closer and closer and closer, with an attempt to do what they call a mine, large explosive, to be able to blow through and breach the fort in order then that they could make an assault. And then coming out of the ravine to the south, you have trenching occurring that again, in its zigzagging fashion, headed ultimately toward the fort, Garrett's fort, occupied, defended by the 20th Alabama. If you like what you see in these videos, you don't click and subscribe and support and all that kind of business to me. Check out the American Battlefield Trust. They not only are incredibly educated historians, but they're also working to preserve a lot of the land that these battlefields are on. If you look at land ownership now in and around Champions Hill, again, 20th Alabama Infantry, and Port Gibson, they are acquiring land as it becomes available, placing it in the trust name temporarily, and then working with the National Park Service to eventually preserve this land. And then they are working in a direction, they'll talk about that on their videos, where they want to work with the National Park Service to open the land back up and put the interpretive signage like you see here at Vicksburg, so that those of us that have ancestors or are otherwise interested in Civil War battlefields in particular, to be able to go and see the battlefields, see the hallowed ground, see where our ancestors fought. Just began walking up onto what was known as the Railroad Redoubt. It, of course, was set up and defended by soldiers from Texas. Where the 20th plays into it was, at one point in time, there was a threat to the line. And you'll see there at the bottom of the tablet that about 35 men, led by Colonel Pettis, the same Edmund Pettis that the very famous bridge near Selma is named after, assisted in retaking of the redoubt. Off in that direction is the railroad, and the redoubt is overlooking it. That is the direction of where the invaders were coming from. And that is the area that was defended by Confederate forces, including the 20th Alabama. As you know, the 20th Alabama was also involved at Port Gibson. There's not a lot to see there just yet. There's a few places to visit, but American Battlefield Trust, doing the wonderful work that they do, is helping to acquire property there. You can also go to Champions Hill, and Champions Hill, there's a good bit more to see. There's an overlook there over the battlefield from one of the invaders' artillery positions, and there are also a couple other places you can go to the crossroads, but of course mostly what you see here in Vicksburg. Again, more information about the railroad redoubt. Involving elements of the various Alabama regiments that were here. You'll see mention of the 30th and the 46th, in addition to 20th Alabama. By this time, Pettis is in command of the regiment. Garrett, of course, fell in battle. Here's the view on Fort Garrett from the other side of the line. This is from a pullout here that's marked as Hovey's Approach. You want to make sure that you stop here if you come to Vicksburg and see where the 20th Alabama was engaged. So this is the view from the aggressor of this war's standpoint. Okay, so now standing on the trail that goes up to the Kentucky Monument from the Union side, as you're driving around the southern portion of the battlefield park, you flow along the Confederate line, which is on the western side of the battlefield, and of course defending Vicksburg. Off in the distance there, the far distance, that's the memorial that's on top of the railroad redoubt. Coming along right about in there, you started to get into Alabama forces, 30th, 31st regiments. You can just barely see it through that opening right there is the Alabama Memorial. It's one of those ones you can't really park in front of. You kind of block the road to get a good picture of it. You can walk back down to it, I suppose, if it's a pretty day. It's a beautiful memorial. Prettiest one out here, if you ask me. And you get on down into this area here, where you begin to see again back toward that tree line back there will be where you start to see elements of the 20th Alabama and the area that they were to defend. And of course there's Fort Garrett. Fort Garrett, defended by the 20th Alabama Infantry Regiment. Garrett is of course killed there in that position, and then assumed the command of the regiment then is assumed by Edmund Pettis. Edmund Pettis leads the 35 men that join in the counterattack when the railroad redoubt is attacked. So you'll see how far the distance is. It's very close, but they brought elements from Fort Garrett, 20th Alabama, up along. They would have traveled along the back of the line. Not very far. You can make that walk in a short period of time. And then they were involved in the counterattack onto the railroad redoubt. If you come to Vicksburg looking for particularly those Alabama regiments that were here, including the 20th, we were generally positioned on the very southern end of what's now preserved by the National Park Service. You can just see the topography down here. This is what the Union was trying to fight across, with our guys holding very strong positions along this ridgeline overlooking Vicksburg. That's generally looking south from the railroad redoubt. Back that way is Vicksburg. And again, the railroad redoubt. Colonel Garrett was the commander up until his death on June the 17th. As you can see from the placard right there, he took over after General Tracy was killed at Port Gibson in the lead up to the siege in Vicksburg. So we're standing in the fort. The fort stood to the Confederate right in the defense of the southern end, commanded by Lee. Twentieth Alabama, of course, was a part of Stevenson's division, which was a part of the Army of Vicksburg, commanded by Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton.